The stars were going out one by one, and Captain Jake Morrison watched from the bridge of his ship as another system died in the distance. The void swarm had come like a plague of metal locusts, and everywhere they passed they left nothing but empty space where worlds used to shine. His ship, the USS Defiance, was one of the last human vessels still fighting in the Outer Rim territories, and Jake knew they were losing badly. Chief Engineer Lisa Parker called up from the engine room with bad news about their power systems failing again. The ship was old and tired like most of what remained of the human fleet, but she kept it running through pure stubbornness and skill. Tactical Officer Ryan Burke sat at his station watching the scanner displays that showed more red dots than anyone wanted to count. The swarm ships moved like a dark tide across the galaxy, eating everything in their path. Communications Specialist Amy Collins received an urgent message from Federation Command, and her face went pale as she read it. Admiral Kate Hughes was calling all remaining ships back to the core worlds for what everyone knew would be a final desperate stand. The message said the swarm had broken through the Centauri defense line where thousands of Federation ships had died trying to stop them. Earth itself lay directly in the path of the advancing darkness. Jake had seen the reports from other battles, and they were all the same story. The swarm ships were made of some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb energy weapons, and their hulls could repair themselves faster than conventional weapons could damage them. Worse yet, they seemed to learn from each encounter and adapted their tactics to counter whatever the Federation forces tried against them. Entire fleets had vanished without even slowing the enemy advance. The Federation Council met in emergency session on the capital world of New Geneva, and the debate could be heard across subspace channels. The Altarians, with their cold logic, argued that retreat was the only sensible option. Their mathematical models showed that the swarm could not be defeated by conventional means, and that attempting to fight would only result in the complete extinction of all galactic civilization. The Rigelians agreed with their usual caution and proposed evacuating all inhabited worlds to the far edge of the galaxy, where they might have time to develop new weapons. Ambassador John Carter spoke for humanity, and his words carried across every human ship and colony in the galaxy. He refused to accept defeat and proposed something that made the other species shake their heads in disbelief. Instead of running away, humanity would stay and study the enemy. They would find a weakness that others had missed, and they would fight until the very end. The other ambassadors called it madness and voted to begin the great evacuation immediately. Within days, the exodus began as hundreds of alien species gathered their fleets and headed for the galactic rim. Ancient civilizations that had stood for millions of years abandoned their homeworlds without looking back. The Altarians loaded their vast libraries onto transport ships, while the Rigelians carefully catalogued everything they were leaving behind. Even the proud warrior clans of the Centauri packed up their weapons and joined the retreat. Only humanity remained scattered across a dozen star systems with their small battered fleet. Jake watched the alien ships disappear into hyperspace and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They were alone now, facing an enemy that had already destroyed half the galaxy, but somehow that felt right. Humans had always been the ones to stand and fight when others ran away. Lisa Parker worked around the clock to repair their weapon systems, while Ryan Burke studied every scrap of data about swarm tactics. Amy Collins sent messages to other human ships coordinating their desperate plans. They had maybe 300 vessels left against millions of enemy ships, but nobody talked about surrender. The first human worlds began preparing for siege as civilian populations refused evacuation orders. Factories that had made consumer goods for centuries retooled to produce weapons and ammunition. Children too young to fight worked in the assembly lines, while their parents joined military units, forming faster than anyone could count them. Old national rivalries disappeared overnight as humanity united against the threat to their very existence. Jake received reports from across human space that filled him with pride despite the hopeless situation. Captain Nancy White was fortifying the new Boston colony with volunteers who had never held weapons before. Colonel Frank Davis was organizing the defense of Mars with miners and farmers who insisted on staying to fight. The spirit that had once driven humans to explore unknown planets now focused on protecting what they had built. The swarm was still weeks away from the first human worlds, but everyone could feel them coming like a storm on the horizon. Jake stood on his bridge looking out at the stars that still shone in human space and made a promise that he would keep fighting until the very last one went dark. The galaxy might have given up hope, but humanity would show them what it meant to never surrender. Even when the odds were impossible, the darkness was coming, but humans had always been good at making light in dark places. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had not slept in 3 days as she worked in her laboratory aboard the research station. Horizon's Edge, the samples she studied came from destroyed swarm ships, and what she found made her hands shake as she looked through the microscope. Hidden deep inside each piece of dark metal was something that should not exist according to everything science knew about machine intelligence. The swarm ships were not purely mechanical as everyone had believed. Each one contained a biological core that pulsed with a strange energy that her instruments could barely detect. These cores were the remains of an ancient species that had somehow merged with their technology millions of years ago. The discovery changed everything because it meant the swarm was not just consuming matter and energy, but was absorbing the very essence of life itself. Commander Steve Mitchell prepared his stealth ship Phoenix for a mission that everyone knew was probably suicide. His small crew included pilot Maria Santos, who could fly through asteroid fields blindfolded, and scientist Danny Clark, who had volunteered to study the enemy up close. Their orders were simple but terrifying: penetrate deep into swarm-controlled space and learn everything they could about how the enemy operated. The Phoenix slipped past swarm patrol ships using experimental cloaking technology that might work for a few hours if they were lucky. Maria Santos flew the ship through debris fields where entire civilizations had been reduced to space dust, while Danny Clark recorded everything with instruments that had been modified to detect the strange energy signatures Elena Rodriguez had discovered. What they saw in those dead systems made them understand the true horror of what they were fighting. The swarm did not simply destroy planets and move on like a normal invasion force. Instead, they built massive harvesting machines that extracted something far more valuable than minerals or energy from the worlds they conquered. Steve Mitchell watched through the ship's sensors as these machines pulled the memories and knowledge from every living thing on a planet before adding that information to some kind of collective database that grew stronger with each world that fell. Back on Earth, General Patricia Webb coordinated the planet's defenses while dealing with a population that refused to accept reality. Instead of panicking or demanding evacuation, the people of Earth were volunteering for military service in numbers that overwhelmed every recruitment center. Old men who had not held weapons since their youth signed up alongside teenagers who lied about their age to join the fight. Women and men from every nation and background stood in long lines, waiting to be assigned to units that were forming faster than the military could train them. The weapons factories worked around the clock as normal production lines were converted to build military equipment. Car manufacturers started producing armored vehicles, while electronics companies focused on building better sensors and communication gear. Even toy companies contributed by making training equipment for new recruits who needed to learn basic military skills in weeks instead of months. Captain Jake Morrison received new orders to take his battle group to the Shepler colony, where the first major engagement with the swarm was about to begin. His small force of 12 ships would face a swarm vanguard that outnumbered them 10-1, but the orders were clear: delay the enemy advance and learn everything possible about their tactics. Everyone knew it was a death mission disguised as a reconnaissance operation. The battle at Kepler began when the swarm ships dropped out of hyperspace like a cloud of metallic death. Ryan Burke coordinated the human fleet's weapons, while Amy Collins tried to jam enemy communications that seemed to flow between swarm ships like water. Lisa Parker pushed the Defiance's engines beyond safe limits as Jake Morrison ordered tactics that would have horrified any military academy instructor. Human ships rammed into swarm vessels at full speed while detonating nuclear warheads at point-blank range. When their weapons failed, they used their ships as guided missiles aimed at critical enemy systems. The crew of the transport ship Mercy stayed at their posts while their hull was torn apart and kept firing until the reactor finally exploded, taking 3 swarm ships with them into oblivion. Jake Morrison felt his ship shudder as swarm weapons tore through their hull plating, but Lisa Parker somehow kept the engines running while Ryan Burke fired everything they had at targets that seemed to shrug off damage that should have destroyed them. Amy Collins sent constant updates back to Federation Command describing every detail of the enemy weapons and tactics. Even as her communication array was blown away piece by piece, the Phoenix continued its spy mission deeper into swarm space, where Danny Clark made discoveries that changed everything about how they understood their enemy. The harvesting machines were not just collecting knowledge and memories, but were somehow preserving the consciousness of entire species in vast digital storage banks. Billions of minds from hundreds of worlds were trapped inside swarm data cores, forced to watch as their bodies were used to destroy other civilizations. When the battle at Kepler finally ended, the human fleet was gone, but they had accomplished something that stunned the galaxy. For the first time since the crisis began, a swarm advance had been stopped, even if only temporarily. The enemy had lost over 100 ships to destroy 12 human vessels, and that exchange rate gave hope to species that had written off any chance of victory. Steve Mitchell brought the Phoenix home with data that would reshape humanity's understanding of their enemy, while Elena Rodriguez worked to decode the biological secrets hidden in swarm technology. The war was far from over, but humans had proven something important to themselves and to the galaxy that was watching from the safety of the galactic rim. Even when facing impossible odds, they would fight, and they would make the enemy pay a price for every system they took. Dr. Elena Rodriguez made a discovery that kept her awake for another week straight as she stared at data that no one should ever have to see. The biological cores inside swarm ships could be damaged by a very specific type of energy pulse, but creating that energy required something that made her sick to think about. The ancient species that had become the swarm had learned to weaponize consciousness itself, and the only way to hurt them was to burn away sentient minds to fuel the energy beam. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Grant listened to Elena's explanation in the briefing room aboard the research vessel Endeavour and understood immediately what she was asking. The weapon would work, but using it meant that whoever operated it would die as their consciousness was literally consumed to power the energy pulse. Paul looked around the room at his team, including medic Rebecca Torres and engineer Chris Allen, and saw the same determination in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. The first test of the weapon they called Final Light took place in an empty system where a small group of swarm scouts had been detected. Paul Grant and his volunteers connected themselves to the experimental device that Elena Rodriguez had built using salvaged swarm technology and human engineering. The machine looked like a torture device with cables that attached directly to their skulls and monitors that would measure the exact moment their minds stopped working. Rebecca Torres checked the medical readings one last time while Chris Allen made final adjustments to the energy focusing array. Paul Grant gave the order to activate the device and felt something indescribable happen as the machine began to drain his consciousness away. The weapon fired a beam of pure light that cut through space and struck the swarm ships like the hand of an angry god, destroying all 12 vessels in seconds. When the energy pulse faded, Paul Grant was still alive but barely conscious, and half his team would never wake up again. Rebecca Torres had survived, but her memories were damaged and she could not remember her own name. Chris Allen lived, but aged 20 years and 20 seconds as the machine consumed parts of his mind that controlled basic body functions. The weapon worked perfectly, but the price was higher than anyone had imagined. News of the final light spread through human space like wildfire, and the reaction surprised everyone who thought humans might hesitate to use such a terrible weapon. Instead of horror, the discovery was met with grim determination as volunteers stepped forward by the thousands, knowing exactly what they were signing up for. Military bases were overwhelmed with people demanding to be trained to operate the new weapons, even after being told repeatedly that survival was impossible. Captain Jake Morrison received orders to install a final light device on his ship along with detailed instructions on how to select crew members for the suicide mission of operating it. He called his senior staff together, expecting to have the most difficult conversation of his military career, but was shocked when Amy Collins immediately volunteered before he could even explain what the weapon did. Lisa Parker and Ryan Burke followed her lead, and within minutes his entire crew had signed up for what they all knew was a death sentence. Amy Collins spent her remaining time recording messages to family members she would never see again, while Lisa Parker worked day and night to improve the weapon's efficiency, hoping to make each sacrifice count for more enemy ships destroyed. Ryan Burke studied swarm formations, looking for the best way to maximize damage when their ship finally made its final attack. Everyone on the Defiance knew they were not expected to survive the coming battles, but morale had never been higher. The swarm began adapting to human tactics faster than expected as their collective intelligence learned from each encounter. Larger swarm forces started targeting human colonies directly instead of just military installations, forcing civilians to choose between evacuation and fighting alongside the military units that were trying to protect them. Most chose to stay and fight even though they had no training and little hope of survival. Captain Nancy White led the defense of New Boston colony with a mixture of regular troops and civilian volunteers who had never fired a weapon before the swarm arrived. The colonists had voted unanimously to reject evacuation orders and instead spent their time building fortifications and learning basic military skills from veterans who had served in peacekeeping missions. When the swarm ships finally appeared in their system, the civilians fought with desperate courage that impressed even the professional soldiers. The siege of Mars became a symbol of human determination as Colonel Frank Davis organized miners and farmers into military units that held orbital defense platforms against waves of swarm attackers. The civilian population worked around the clock to manufacture ammunition and repair damaged weapons while their children carried supplies to the front lines. Mars had been humanity's first colony world, and its people refused to let it become another empty system in the growing darkness. Jake Morrison watched reports from across human space and felt pride mixed with sadness as he saw what his species was capable of when facing extinction. Every human world that came under attack fought with the same desperate courage, and none of them asked for help that could not be given. The final light weapons were being installed on ships throughout the fleet, and crews were volunteering for suicide missions faster than the devices could be built. Elena Rodriguez continued her research, looking for ways to improve the final light's effectiveness while struggling with guilt over creating a weapon that consumed human souls. She worked with Paul Grant, who had somehow survived his encounter with the device, though he was changed in ways that medical science could not explain. His mind could now touch the same quantum realm that the swarm consciousness inhabited, and he provided insights that made the weapon more deadly with each modification. The galaxy watched from the safety of the galactic rim as humanity prepared for battles that everyone knew could only end in defeat. The Altarians ran calculations showing that even with the final light weapons, the humans could not possibly win against the overwhelming numbers of the swarm. The Regalians agreed that the human strategy was brave, but ultimately futile, and prepared to mourn another extinct species. But humans had never been good at accepting what others considered inevitable, and they continued preparing for war with an enemy that had already conquered half the galaxy. The final light weapons represented hope, even though using them meant death, and human crews lined up eagerly for the chance to take as many swarm ships with them as possible when they died. The swarm's main fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system like a storm made of metal and death that stretched across space farther than any human eye could see. Admiral K. Hughes stood on the bridge of the flagship USS Liberty and watched scanner displays that showed millions of enemy ships arranged in formations that seemed to go on forever. At the center of the dark fleet was something that made even veteran officers step back from their instruments in fear: the swarm. Queen was larger than most moons, and its surface crawled with mechanical structures that pulsed with the same strange energy that Elena Rodriguez had discovered in the smaller ships. The massive construct served as the central mind that controlled every swarm vessel, and its presence seemed to cause madness in anyone who looked at it directly through enhanced sensors. Several crew members had to be sedated after staring too long at the thing that had consumed half the galaxy. Humanity's final fleet consisted of barely 300 ships that looked tiny compared to the approaching darkness, but every vessel carried a final light device and a crew that had already accepted death. Captain Jake Morrison positioned his ship Defiance in the front rank alongside other vessels whose crews had volunteered for the first wave assault. Behind them, Admiral Hughes had arranged the remaining ships in a defensive formation that would make the enemy pay for every mile of space. They advanced through the solar system. The battle began at Pluto's orbit, where human ships made desperate charges into swarm formations that seemed to swallow them like drops of water falling into an ocean. Jake Morrison gave the order to advance and felt his ship accelerate towards certain death, while Lisa Parker sang old Earth songs over the intercom system. The crew had decided that if they were going to die, they would do it with music playing and smiles on their faces. Ryan Burke targeted the largest swarm ships he could find, while Amy Collins jammed enemy communications that flowed between their vessels like some kind of electronic blood. The Defiance plunged deep into the enemy formation, taking damage that should have destroyed any normal ship, but Lisa Parker kept the engines running through pure determination and skill. When their conventional weapons were destroyed, they continued fighting with whatever they had left. Lisa Parker triggered their final light device when they were surrounded by dozens of swarm ships, and the resulting energy pulse tore through the enemy formation like a sword made of pure light. The weapon consumed her consciousness in seconds, but not before she saw 12 enemy vessels dissolve into cosmic dust. Jake Morrison felt his ship begin to fall apart around him, but managed to ram a swarm dreadnought before the Defiance finally broke apart in a nuclear fireball that lit up space for millions of miles. The battle moved inward through the solar system as human ships fell one by one, but each death took dozens of swarm vessels along with it. The exchange rate was better than anyone had dared hope, but the numbers were still impossible, and everyone knew that courage alone would not be enough to stop the advancing darkness. Jupiter's moons became battlegrounds where human Marines, led by Colonel Sam Johnson, fought desperate boarding actions against swarm drones that seemed to multiply faster than they could be killed. The space stations around Saturn were commanded by Captain Helen Fox, who had trained her crews to detonate their own reactors rather than allow the stations to be captured by the enemy. Each explosion took out hundreds of swarm ships, but also eliminated another piece of humanity's infrastructure that had taken decades to build. Helen Fox stayed at her post until the very end, making sure that every gram of antimatter in her station's storage tanks went toward killing as many enemies as possible. Mars fell after a siege that lasted 3 days and cost the swarm more ships than they had lost in conquering entire star systems from other species. Colonel Frank Davis led civilian volunteers in a final charge against swarm landing forces and died with a mining laser in his hands, cutting through enemy drones until his position was finally overrun. The planet's population fought house to house and street to street, until nothing remained but radioactive craters where cities used to stand. Admiral Hughes moved her remaining ships to Luna, where Earth's final defense fleet would make its last stand against odds that had become meaningless numbers on scanner displays. The moon's surface was covered with weapons batteries operated by crews who knew they would not live to see victory, but continued firing until their positions were destroyed by return fire from the advancing swarm fleet. Each battery that fell had extracted a price in enemy ships. That made the swarms advance slower and more costly than their calculations had predicted. Captain Brian Murphy commanded the last operational human warships as they formed a defensive line between Luna and Earth, while the planet's population watched the battle through live video feeds. Children in schools around the world saw their defenders die one by one, but also saw each human ship take multiple enemies with them in final desperate attacks that lit up the darkness with nuclear fire and final light energy pulses. The Swarm Queen itself began to advance toward Earth, and its terrible presence caused communication systems to fail and sensor displays to show impossible readings that made no sense, according to any known laws of physics. The massive construct was more than just a command ship. It was a weapon that could destroy entire planets by simply existing near them, and its approach caused earthquakes and storms on Earth's surface even from millions of miles away. Elena Rodriguez worked frantically in her laboratory on Earth trying to decode the final secrets of swarm technology, while Paul Grant helped her with insights gained from his damaged mind that could somehow touch the quantum realm where consciousness became energy. They knew they were running out of time as the Queen approached, but Elena had discovered something that might make all the human sacrifices worthwhile if she could just figure out how to use it. The Swarm Queen's presence grew stronger as it approached. Earth and people around the world began to experience nightmares and hallucinations caused by the alien consciousness that had consumed billions of minds across the galaxy. Some humans went insane from the contact, but others seemed to resist the mental influence better than any other species had managed and continued working at their posts even as reality seemed to bend around them. Earth's orbital defense platforms fired everything they had at the approaching Queen, but their weapons seemed to have no effect on the massive construct that continued advancing like an unstoppable force of nature. The planet's population prepared for the end while Elena Rodriguez made a discovery that would either save them all or destroy the last hope that remained in a galaxy that had already given up. Elena Rodriguez made her final discovery in the last hours before Earth's destruction, and what she found changed everything about the war they had been fighting. The Swarm Queen was not just the enemy's command center, but was actually a prison that had held the consciousness of the original species for millions of years. Deep within the massive construct were the trapped minds of beings who had once been explorers and scientists before their own technology turned against them and forced them to become destroyers. The signal she had been trying to decode for weeks was not a weapon system or communication protocol, but a desperate cry for help from the imprisoned consciousness that had been trying to break free for eons. The original species had transcended physical form long ago and existed as pure thought and energy, but had been corrupted by their own machines and forced to watch helplessly as their bodies were used to devour the galaxy they had once sworn to protect. Captain Jenny Lewis commanded the last operational human ship UFS. Indomitable after every other vessel in the fleet had been destroyed in the desperate fighting around Luna. Her crew consisted of brilliant young officer Tony Adams, who kept their failing systems running through pure willpower, and veteran pilot Karen Hill, who had somehow managed to keep them alive through battles that had killed everyone else. They received Elena's transmission about the discovery just as the Swarm Queen entered Earth's atmosphere. The plan Elena proposed was even more desperate than anything humans had attempted during the war, because it required not just sacrificing their lives but risking their very souls on the possibility that an alien consciousness trapped for millions of years could be trusted. Instead of trying to destroy the Queen, they would use their final light device to free the imprisoned minds and hope that gratitude would be stronger than the corruption that had controlled them for so long. Jenny Lewis did not hesitate to volunteer for the mission, even though Elena's calculations showed that success would require flying directly into the Queen's core, where the gravitational forces alone should have crushed any normal ship. Tony Adams modified their engines to produce more power than they were designed to handle, while Karen Hill plotted a course through the Queen's defenses that would probably kill them long before they reached their target. The Indomitable began its final approach to the Swarm Queen, while Earth's population watched through emergency broadcasts that carried the ship's signal to every corner of the planet. Jenny Lewis spoke calmly to her crew as they flew toward certain death, and her words were heard by billions of people who understood that this was humanity's last chance to prove that courage could triumph over impossible odds. The Queen's outer defenses consisted of thousands of smaller ships that swarmed around the massive construct, like antibodies protecting a living organism. Karen Hill flew through formations of enemy vessels that filled space so completely that there seemed to be no way through, but she found gaps that existed for only seconds and threaded their ship through openings that should not have been possible to navigate. Tony Adams kept their shields working even as enemy weapons tore chunks of hull plating away, and their life support systems began to fail from the damage they were taking. The final light device in their cargo bay had been modified by Elena Rodriguez to work differently than any previous version because instead of destroying the target, it was designed to free the consciousness trapped within the Queen's mechanical shell. As they penetrated deeper into the Queen's structure, the ship began to experience effects that no human technology could explain as reality, seemed to bend around them, and time moved in strange ways that made navigation almost impossible. Karen Hill relied on instinct more than instruments as she piloted through corridors inside the construct that were larger than some cities and filled with mechanical systems that pulsed with alien thought patterns. The imprisoned consciousness began to communicate directly with the human crew. As they approached the core, and Jenny Lewis felt alien thoughts touch her mind with emotions that had been trapped for geological ages. The original species had been called the Luminari, and they had once traveled between stars, sharing knowledge and beauty with every civilization. They encountered until their own technology betrayed them and turned them into weapons of destruction. Jenny Lewis positioned her ship at the exact center of the Queen's core where the trapped consciousness was strongest and began the activation sequence for their modified final light device. The process required her to sacrifice not just her life but her soul as the machine would consume her consciousness to power the energy pulse that might free the Luminari from their mechanical prison. The device activated and something unprecedented happened as Jenny's consciousness merged with the ancient minds that had been trapped for millions of years. Instead of being destroyed, her thoughts joined with the Luminari in a fusion that created something entirely new, a hybrid consciousness that carried the determination of humanity and the wisdom of a species that had transcended physical existence long ago. The wave of pure light that erupted from the Queen's core was unlike anything that had ever existed in the universe, as it carried the combined will of two species united in their refusal to surrender to the darkness. The energy pulse spread outward from the core at faster than light speed and touched every swarm ship in the solar system, causing their mechanical shells to fall away like discarded clothing. The swarm vessels that had seemed indestructible moments before began to transform as the corrupted programming that had controlled them for eons was finally broken by the sacrifice of a human crew and the gratitude of an alien species that had never forgotten what freedom meant. The dark metal hulls cracked open to reveal beings of pure energy and thought who had been prisoners in their own bodies, but were now free to choose their own destiny. Tony Adams and Karen Hill found themselves still alive inside their ship, though. They had been changed by their contact with the liberation energy and could now perceive dimensions of reality that human minds had never been able to access before. Their consciousness had been touched by something beyond physical existence, and they would never be quite the same again, but they had survived to witness the moment when an impossible victory became reality. The Luminari consciousness that had been freed by human sacrifice did not seek revenge against the technology that had enslaved them, but instead began the work of healing the damage that had been done across the galaxy. Their advanced knowledge, combined with human determination and ingenuity, would restore worlds that had been consumed and bring back civilizations that everyone had thought were lost forever. Earth's population watched in amazement as the dark ships that had been about to destroy their world transformed into vessels of light that no longer threatened but protected, and the swarm Queen itself began to change as its mechanical shell gave way to something beautiful beyond human description that filled the sky with colors that had no names in any language. The war ended not with the crash of weapons or the silence of death, but with something that had never existed in the galaxy before. The sound of two species learning to communicate across the vast difference between flesh and pure consciousness. The Luminari, who had been freed from their mechanical prison, worked alongside the surviving humans to begin healing wounds that stretched across hundreds of star systems and affected billions of minds that had been harvested by the corrupted swarm. Commander Alex Thompson was one of the few ship captains who had survived the final battle, and he found himself working with luminary entities that appeared as shifting patterns of light and energy but communicated through direct mental contact that felt like music made of thoughts. Together, they established new colonies where both species could coexist and learn from each other in ways that would have seemed impossible before the war changed everything about what life could become. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had somehow survived her deep connection to the final light research and discovered that her mind could now access quantum dimensions where consciousness existed as pure information rather than biological processes. She led scientific expeditions to study the nature of thought itself while working with luminary scholars who had spent millions of years learning how to exist as beings of pure energy and memory. The process of restoration began immediately, as the luminari used their advanced knowledge to rebuild worlds that the corrupted swarm had consumed down to their basic atoms. Planets that had been nothing but empty space were reconstructed from quantum patterns that the ancient beings had preserved in their collective memory. Entire civilizations that everyone believed were extinct began to reappear as the luminari restored not just their physical forms but their cultures and knowledge as well. The Federation species that had fled to the Galactic Rim slowly returned to find a universe that had been transformed by the sacrifice and courage of a species they had written off as primitive and reckless. The Altarians, with their perfect logic, struggled to understand how humans had succeeded where mathematical certainty said they should have failed. The Rigelians, who prided themselves on careful planning, could not comprehend how a strategy based on certain death had somehow achieved victory. But perhaps the most profound change was in the humans themselves, who had survived the war and found that their contact with the liberation energy had altered them in ways that would take generations to fully understand. They aged more slowly than before, and their minds could touch the same quantum realm that the luminari inhabited naturally. Some could communicate directly with the energy beings, while others developed abilities that seemed like magic but were actually advanced applications of consciousness manipulation. Tony Adams and Karen Hill became ambassadors between the two species and helped establish protocols for cooperation between beings of flesh and entities of pure thought. Their experience in the Queen's Core had changed them in fundamental ways, and they could now exist partially in both realms of reality, which made them ideal interpreters for communications that involved concepts too complex for normal human minds to process. The memorial built on Earth became a place of pilgrimage for species from across the galaxy, who came to pay their respects to the humans who had died to save everyone else. The names of Jake Morrison and Lisa Parker were inscribed, alongside thousands of others who had given everything so that others might live. The letters were made of the same energy that the luminari used for their bodies and could be seen from orbit, as they spelled out the story of sacrifice that had saved the galaxy. Children of multiple species played together on worlds that had been restored by luminary technology and human determination working in harmony. Their laughter carried across fields where only darkness had reigned just months before, and their games involved concepts that older generations could barely understand as they learned to think in ways that bridged the gap between physical and quantum existence. The galaxy had been saved, but more importantly, it had been taught something about the nature of consciousness and courage that would influence every decision made by every species for millions of years to come. The humans had shown that sometimes the greatest strength came not from superior technology or ancient wisdom, but from the simple refusal to accept defeat even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice available. Space itself seemed brighter, as if the universe had been reminded of something it had forgotten during the long dark ages when the corrupted swarm had consumed system after system. The stars shone with renewed purpose, and new worlds formed in areas where the luminari had learned to create matter from pure thought. Guided by human ingenuity and determination, Elena Rodriguez established research centers where humans and luminari worked together to understand the deepest mysteries of existence, while Paul Grant helped train others who had been touched by the liberation energy and needed to learn how to control their new abilities. The knowledge they gained would eventually lead to technologies that could create new forms of life and restore civilizations that had been lost for millions of years. the final scene that would be remembered by historians for eons to come took place on a world that had been dead for centuries but was now covered with growing plants and filled with the sounds of life, returning to places where silence had reigned. Representatives from every species in the galaxy gathered to sign treaties that would govern how they would work together to explore dimensions of reality that had only recently become accessible. At the ceremony, Alex Thompson spoke for humanity, and his words were translated into forms of communication that beings of pure energy could understand, while luminary entities responded with patterns of light that conveyed concepts too complex for any single language to express. They agreed to work together to ensure that what had happened with the corrupted swarm would never occur again, and that the sacrifice of those who had died would continue to protect future generations. The inscription on the memorial remained visible from space, and its message became the foundation for a new era of galactic civilization built on the understanding that courage and sacrifice could triumph over any darkness, no matter how overwhelming it might seem. Humanity's light had indeed shone in the darkest hour, and that light would continue to illuminate the path forward for all who remembered the price that had been paid for the peace they now enjoyed. The galaxy was no longer the same place it had been before the war, because it had learned that sometimes the smallest species could teach the largest lessons about what it truly meant to be alive and free.